So here we are back for part two. And so we take that last section, which had the DDoS attack, which is a real thing. That was a real scenario that I laid out, how it unfolded. And we ask ourselves, we take a step back and say, what security governance did we have in place that would have helped stop this? Or what security governance do we need to put in place based on this event, right? So security governance is that collection of practices related to supporting, defining, and directing the security efforts in your company. So what we do is we define the core security principles, who's accountable, the actions of the organization. What are we going to do to ensure that our objectives are achieved? So security governance is really closely related and often intertwined with that corporate and IT governance also. We have IT governance, which is part of the business, corporate governance, which is definitely the executives in the business, and we've got this information security governance. And so the board that we're looking for to approve the policy is going to be in that corporate governance realm somewhere, right? So all forms of governance, including security governance, have to be assessed and verified from time to time. So it's not a once and done. You would go back and redo it. As we know, technology and the threat is constantly changing the landscape. So this is just another picture of how it might look, right? This enterprise governance on down. But we want to ensure some key items, like there's strategic alignment between enterprise governance and security governance. We want to make sure we're aligned. And that's really an emphasis item in every business I've ever been a part of. We want to make sure we assess risk management, right, that are facing the organization and how we can mitigate them. We want to make sure our policy delivers value, right? Never interrupt order to cash, for example, right? And we want to make sure that candidates that candidate policy items ensure security investment, right? If we say there's an issue, we want to then add it to our budget items. And then, of course, we'll have resource management, performance management as part of it. Integration is also key here, right? We want to make sure we integrate with that governance to ensure alignment. So it's kind of a rehash, but I just thought the picture was worth it. So information security governance, then continuing, is governance is that managing, and I think I mentioned this earlier, directing, controlling, and influencing the organization, its actions, its behaviors. And as security governance, we tie into enterprise governance and IT governance. So we want to make sure that information security within our organization as a domain, right, requires the right group to ensure responsibility for security management and a scope of authority, right? So in an organization, generally, a board of directors is, or some equivalent to them, is generally that authoritative policy-making body that frankly, a company should only have maybe max 15 to 20 policy statements, right? But if you have a new one, you want to up channel it up through the board of directors or its equivalent. And day-to-day responsibilities then are left to management, where executive management is going to provide the policy and the resources and the support, etc., right? And so this is kind of what we're looking for here. Now, there's a distributed governance model that could be taken into consideration. So on the picture on the slide, you can see I have the formal structure. It's a typical governance structure, right, with a hierarchy. But a distributed governance structure looks a little different. This is the specification of principles or methods that enable a scalable coordination for forming a consensus. And it's really going to help, I think, legitimate decisions that are made in terms of security policy. So in these systems, everyone is treated equally without the presence of a central actor or without the hierarchy that you see in the picture on the left, right? And so the distributed governance model has several parties associated with it, including a CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, who should be separate and not part of IT. Even though we think of it in terms of IT, you need to be independent because IT is going to make business decisions, right? And so to this list of players in the governance model, again, I would add some other things. I would add security architecture or maybe even enterprise architecture to that conversational list, right? And so the CISO is used in a large organization. In a small organization, they might be called an ISO, which is just the Information Security Officer. They're equivalent, basically, but a CISO is usually used in a very large organization. And they provide now expert leadership. They're a leader, teacher. They're a champion for security, right? And they're going to help facilitate the right security role for IT, for HR, for legal, facilities, etc., etc. The list goes on and on. There is sometimes a source of conflict in companies in who the ISO or CISO should report to. As I've mentioned, I do not recommend they report to IT. They ought to report to the CEO, or if not CEO, to the risk manager of a company, or if not, then maybe even to the financial management, right? But not to IT. And sometimes you will find it that way, right? The COO or risk management is really what I would emphasize in the reporting structure, right? And so the CISO is going to help create this culture of security. It has a positive influence on the company at all kinds of levels. It ensures the security requirements and business requirements are integrated, right? Including operations, risk, compliance, marketing, audit, sales, HR, and even legal, right? So these are some of the things that you want to consider. A compliance officer, these titles are all addressed on page 103 of the book. The one thing we're going to have to decide are who are data owners and data custodians, right? The key difference between them is a data owner sets the policy. The data custodians, they are doers. They implement the policy. So the owners decide, the custodians do, is really how that's defined, okay? There are regulatory requirements, which is some of the policy that we are going to be looking to implement. The Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, right? GLBA, it's often called. This designates an employee or maybe a group to coordinate information security program efforts, right? So it's codified in law. So companies that offer, for example, financial products or loans even, investment advice, maybe even insurance, they have to be able to explain their information sharing practices and the safeguarding of sensitive data, right? That's how that might be applied. If HIPAA is your concern, right, there are parts to HIPAA: administrative safeguards, technical safeguards, and physical safeguards. And you'd want to be sure that those are addressed with an identified security official who is responsible for that, right? PCI DSS, I can't wait. We've got a chapter here coming up on that. It's the payment card industry is protecting you when you're not even out, when you don't even think it, when you swipe in your credit card, for example, right? And that's what the payment card industry, or PCI DSS, covers. And it covers various things like the handling of your data by computer systems that process your payments, the separation of data execution and data storage. It guards against employee theft of your data from your credit card. It guards against internet intrusions of your data. It ensures the data is disposed of, so that, for example, what was saved on a hard drive, and it will even ensure tracking of human access to the hardware. So it's really kind of exciting that the regulatory requirements that provide safeguards, but that drive roles and responsibilities in any organization. So information security risk is the second part of this chapter after governance, right? And there are really three factors that influence security decision making. There are the guiding principles, which we've talked about, the regulatory requirements, I just touched on a few, and now risks, right? So risk is the potential of this undesirable outcome or unfavorable outcome. And the motivation for others taking risk is to pursue the favorable outcome, right? So if there's value, expect that hackers will go after it, right? And so we want to manage risk. And this implies that we have the tools and people and processes in place to mitigate the risk, which is the likelihood of a positive outcome for the attacker. And so one of the things we want to talk about is down here in terms of risk tolerance and risk appetite. You maybe want to pause and review those definitions, because in this slide I try and lay out in a picture form what's going on. So we have this probability of a risk, right? How likely is it to happen? And down on the horizontal axis we have this risk attitude, the impact of a risk. What is the impact? So we have probability times impact. That really defines a risk for us. And so I have these definitions up here, and we want to assess our executive leadership in terms of the risk appetite. How much risk are they willing, or uncertainty, are they really willing to accept? And then in the middle here you have some sort of risk tolerance, right? Where they don't normally accept it, but they can be pushed to accept it. And then up here you have stakeholder risk threshold, where they will not accept risk above that threshold in any circumstance, right? And I've laid out the definitions here. So I hope that's helpful. When we make information security risk decisions, we are thinking in terms of probability and impact, because that really defines risk. And we want to assess our stakeholders, because our security efforts are to support the business value, right? So we want to assess what risk they're willing to accept, what risk they could be pushed to accept through tolerance, and what risk is beyond the pale, which is how I would share that. So the risk assessment includes a cybersecurity risk assessment, right? Which is going to identify various information assets that could be affected by a cyber attack, like the DDoS attack that we looked at. What hardware, what systems, what laptops, what computer data, what intellectual property, right? We want to identify all that. And then we want to identify the various risks that could be associated with that asset. And that's why I presented this DDoS type attack to us, to make this practical or more real. So risk can be avoided largely by countering the threats facing an asset, or by eliminating even the exposure to the asset. So the risk by itself isn't good or bad, right? It's really neither, right? We get in our car, we drive to work. There are risks. It's not good or bad. Risk taking is necessary. You can't make money unless you're willing to take a risk. So the question comes in, how much risk do we want to take, right? And so even once we're done assessing risks, we want to then assess residual risk. What risk is left over that we haven't mitigated? This could include things like cloud computing, onboarding or offboarding of business partners, which should be tied to IAM, social media networks and applications I would offer, interoperability agreements like SLAs, including vendor management, privacy, unauthorized data sharing, data ownership, and even data backups. The list is long and exciting and could go on further. Let's come back for part 3 shortly.